All right. I think we're on. I'm going to retweet this from my own. There we go. Murad, can you hear me?
Yep.
All right. It's good to see you, man.
Likewise. Thanks for the invite.
Yeah, it's been a while. I think
Yeah.
you and your bro came through LA. When was that? Maybe May or June?
Late May.
Late May. Wow, 6 months.
Yeah.
It's eons. I think this company that we're working on was just like an idea at the time, and we had some designs.
Yeah. I remember you guys grinding hard back then.
Yeah, pretty cool. And you launched Adaptive, I believe, July 1st, right? Wasn't that the
Yep.
first? Yeah. So quite the feat, raising a fund and getting going. Most of that done in the winter,
Right.
literally.
Right.
So congrats to you for getting that off the ground.
Thank you.
Yeah. So where are you today? If that's not blowing your OPSEC.
I am in Eastern Europe at the moment. Let's
All
leave
right.
it at that.
Undisclosed Eastern European location. Very cool. Well, I'm here with terrible OPSEC in the Los Angeles area, and people who know me know where I am. So yeah, we've got a few topics that we wanted to hit. I think people see Murad and they want to know what's going to happen with Bitcoin. So we'll give them what they want right out of the gate, and however you want to take it, and I'll just chime in. But where are we sort of in price development, and what are you seeing, into 2020, and with regards to the halving, and then we can tie that into some long-term forecasts as well.
Yeah. So I think clearly the bullishness that was to be expected from the halving coming up got front ran a little bit too early in the first half of 2019. Personally, I'm expecting a little bit more of a bleed with kind of a slight downward slant, so to speak, until the end of the year. I am extremely bullish for 2020 because I think that kind of once this last batch of premature longs and premature bullishness in general is kind of driven away, I think that kind of late December onwards, I'm expecting a beginning of more bullish developments.
Nice.
I would say that we're kind of still in the middle of this parabolic sell-off right now. The fact that the big China Xi candle, as they call it, is already more than 75% retraced is not great locally. But I think that we probably need one more flush down. But after that, I'm expecting sort of more sideways and then a beginning of a grind upwards.
Nice. But thinking that probably doesn't actually happen until we're through the end of the year.
Yeah, kind of Christmas time is where some of my targets are pointing to.
Yeah. And, you guys are pretty well known for a few different indicators, some of them that you just like that other people have come up with, and some that you guys kind of, between you and Willie and David, are more or less your creations. What are some of the indicators that you think are kind of most relevant in a market like this? And, what's kind of carrying the day that you guys look at closely right now?
Yeah, so I would say that, so I think that especially as of late, the on-chain, off-chain kind of market structure is really evolving quickly. So especially in terms of like predicting short and medium-term prices, I think kind of traditional technical analysis, more kind of traditional statistics, just things like that are more powerful than on-chain. On-chain is better for kind of longer-term thinking. That being said, I would say that because the amount of volume on derivative exchanges is like almost an order of magnitude bigger than the actual spot volumes, I think that you want to focus on like all of the market dynamics on derivative exchanges. I kind of like to say that this market is really often a lot about kind of traps and these like local kind of short-term, especially on lower time frames, like various manipulations. And so because of that, the derivative kind of volumes is what you want to be focused on. Right now, I'm reluctant to say that the Bitcoin has bottomed because the funding rates across the biggest derivative exchanges are still positive, which really is telling me that we are still potentially ripe for a long squeeze. And so that's kind of on the funding rate side. Also, I would say that a couple of exchanges such as OKX in China have what they call a long to short ratio. Currently, it's hovering around 2-to-1. So in terms of like without delving in the actual value or the number of contracts, which is obviously equal, in terms of the number of users, there's twice as many longs as there are shorts, at least there, which also isn't screaming kind of a bottom to me quite yet. So ideally and historically, especially when you're talking about macro timeframes, Bitcoin bottoms when like super apocalyptic charts start coming out and people get super, super bullish and you get everybody short, et cetera, et cetera. I think we're approaching there. Look, in the last couple of weeks, we're getting closer and closer to that point, but we're not quite there yet. So I wouldn't be surprised with kind of one more flush down.
Okay, interesting. So let's talk about like way off in the future. I mean, I think you reached a new peak of popularity last fall with your guest appearance on Anthony Pompliano's show Off the Chain, and talked about like, you know, with a very critical mind and rational thinking and not just hopium, you know, why eventually we get to something like $10 million a coin. I would love just kind of like a recap of that, and then just kind of any sort of twists in your thinking, because it's been a year now, and just kind of how you're thinking about the long-term price progression.
Absolutely. So I still strongly believe essentially almost everything that I've said back then. I think it's inevitable that Bitcoin or something like Bitcoin, but at the moment, there's really no other competition, essentially supplants fiat forms of money in the world. I think that as time goes by, more and more people will realize that simply Bitcoin will preserve their wealth far better than fiat money does, without having to essentially constantly chase kind of various investment opportunities or overextended consumption or going into unnecessary debt, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And I think kind of more and more people around the world are realizing that this discrepancy between Bitcoin's scarcity, while essentially all other forms of monies and currencies is just constantly getting inflated, right? So I think as Bitcoin gains popularity, it's both price growth and then other just network growth will continue to accelerate. I would say that so here's kind of the way I'm thinking about it. They always say that like people underestimate what's going to happen in like 1 or 2 years, but they underestimate what's going to happen in 10 years. And right now, I think even though the market has quieted down a little bit in the last kind of half a year or so, I would say that there's a lot of sort of technological and infrastructural underpinnings that are being built. And I still think that we are kind of in the middle of this kind of third large bull market. And I wouldn't be surprised if it really gets out of control kind of in the next 2.5 years, potentially even to an even greater degree than 2017. A lot of the market infrastructure, custody infrastructure, insurance infrastructure, and all these other things have been built and are being built right now that will allow for much bigger players to get involved. Like really in 2017, that was by far predominantly retail driven. But right now we have the kind of pipelines which will allow institutional players to get involved. And given, once again, not only Bitcoin's scarcity fundamentally, but even like there's even less Bitcoin in circulation that's like available on exchanges, that's available for active trading. And if we see even a modicum of institutional interest, which I believe strongly we will, then I think there will come a point where Bitcoin's price will simply go vertical.
Yeah, it's interesting when you look at, I think it was like the last 5 years, we've seen something like a 45x, basically, if you just look at the last 5 years from today. And then, you know, that seems within the range of a lot of people's, you know, sort of bullish scenario forecasts from here to the peak of this coming bull, which is weird because you would usually look at, you know, the law of large numbers and say that you couldn't keep going with the same percentage increases. But, you know, if we're at 8K, and I've heard a lot of people say like 150 to 300 for a peak, you know, in late 2021 or early 22 or something like that. And, you know, that's your almost 40x from here.
Right.
It's crazy. We will see, and we will be hoping with our hopium and our logical brains.
Right.
Very cool. Well, let's shift gears for a minute, and I just wanted to just kind of ask you some questions about being an entrepreneur. I mean, you were kind of just trading, and then now you have, you know, investors and operations and a real business to run. And just kind of like, how's that been for you transitioning over to, you know, running a real intense business with people that really care about how it's going?
Yeah, I mean, it's been going well so far. I would say that it's definitely a lot harder than managing your own money because there are just a bit more constraints. Like on the operational side, like of course you need to get audited, you need to get administrated, you need to sort of have tighter risk limits, tighter kind of risk controls, like a bit more formal approach to custody, et cetera, et cetera. In general, probably the most important thing is that essentially when the amount of money that you have under management goes up, it's just both for liquidity constraint reasons, but also for, I would say, just in terms of the way, especially like derivative markets are structured, it like the amount of risk that you can take really shrinks. So you really need to be on the lookout for opportunities, like at an even deeper level. It's just not as easy to just be like flipping between positions like many times in the middle of the same day. And in general, you just have to start thinking like a little bit more macro and a little bit more long term. But I would guess like those are the main differences.
Yeah, interesting. Well, definitely promised you an update on Give Bitcoin. So thank you for being one of our earliest backers back over the summer. Great to have you involved and to have had your advice on the product. You know, so yeah, we are going live to everybody on Thursday. So that's very exciting. We decided if we were going to be ready this week, we might as well just wait for the 21st because hey, 21 is
right.
everything.
Right.
So excited about that. Anybody watching here can already start using it at beta.givebitcoin.io, and that will just swap over to the main URL on Thursday. But yeah, it's been really exciting. We love how snappy and fast and intuitive the product has become. We've been thrilled to see both the number of transactions coming through in the beta and also the size. I think has been surprising. There've been a lot of $100, $250, $500 gifts, and then a couple of outliers already. Somebody gave their niece and nephew $4,500 each on Thursday or Friday last week, so that was pretty cool to see that come across. And then yeah, the guide to Bitcoin, the New Coiners guide to Bitcoin is coming along nicely. We're kind of at a final draft of chapter 1, and so Jan Pritzker and Stefan Livera are going through and giving us our final sort of comments on that. And then we've got like a pretty good draft of chapter 2 and chapter 3. So that's all coming along. And I think we're really kind of firming up, kind of what the outline for the rest of the chapters and kind of what we're going to cover and taking lots and lots of feedback from obviously our advisors and other people in the community. We've also decided to make, an audio version of everything. So that's going to be pretty exciting. And it's actually all being written in a Q&A format. So it's like a new coiner asking the questions and then someone, kind of an expert reading the answers. So it's a bit of a conversation. So we have a really good voiceover actor to do the questions. And then, of course, this being Bitcoin, you have to get Guy Swan from Cryptoconomy to read the answers, the voice of Bitcoin. So he'll be doing that for us, which we're really excited about. Let's see what else. Yeah, I don't know. I think we feel really good about the core Bitcoin community and thinking about, Bitcoiners giving to Bitcoiners, Bitcoiners giving to new coiners, and then also, people who like Bitcoin and want more of it actually requesting Bitcoin as a present and putting it on their wish list. And we think that's a big vector for spreading this. One of the things that's come up a lot as we've gotten out there is how many people think there's an opportunity to let someone who's not a Bitcoiner give Bitcoin to someone else who's not a Bitcoiner. And this is kind of thinking about, the $125 billion, US corporate gifting market or the $400 billion global gift card market, and letting somebody be, the Bitcoin boss or, give Bitcoin bonuses, or letting an ad tech startup, give some Bitcoin to the media agency or, whatever it is, that kind of thing. So I think that's kind of an interesting way to think about it as well. Just after launch, and already under development, is our referral program. And I think this will be really, really interesting. So this basically takes us from like a one-to-many Bitcoin marketing platform and turns it into many-to-many. So we're going to share 50% of our transaction fees with referrers and let people stack sats. It's all paid out in Bitcoin. And you'll be able to track how you're doing and how many new coiners you created, and basically, essentially make our educational materials available so that Bitcoin meetups and, the Blockchain Education Network and Blockchain Berkeley and all these people can kind of, arm themselves with Bitcoin educational materials, and then always have a ref code that then lets you earn sats in perpetuity for everyone that you sign up for Give Bitcoin.
That's really cool. That's really cool. I like that.
Yeah, we're really excited. I mean, honestly, you've probably seen the same stat that I have, that one of the OG funds put out. I think it's pretty private, but they basically ran the analysis that there's probably only about 7 million people that own more than $100 worth of Bitcoin globally. And, it's our goal to create another 21 million people that own at least $100 worth of Bitcoin. So, I think that's, it's a worthy goal. And I think we kind of have the dynamic built into the product with that virality and with putting, Bitcoiners to work selling Bitcoin and asking for Bitcoin from boomers. We're not going to leave boomers out. We're going to pull them into Bitcoin by having their kids ask them for Bitcoin for Christmas, for bar mitzvah, for, graduation, etc. So yeah, we're really optimistic that this thing will work. And we're just trying to do our best to optimize it and just spread the word. So.
Yeah, that sounds amazing. It looks like you guys are doing a lot of progress. Like the fact that I really like how you're giving 50% of the transaction fees to referrals. I think that's going to really incentivize a lot of people to kind of refer others for sure. Yeah,
we're really excited. We just think it's so direct. It's like sell some Bitcoin, earn some Bitcoin.
Right.
Or just tell people about Bitcoin. Like all I wanted to do setting out to do this, as we started talking last fall, is I was just trying to figure out some way to make money by talking about Bitcoin.
Right.
And hopefully we can now let anybody do that. And then hopefully those sats that people earn end up being worth, 10x or 100x in the future. And this ends up being like a really meaningful activity.
For sure.
Yeah. So, I saw your partner, Willie, put out a really nice tweet storm yesterday, just talking about the way he sort of stacks and frames and tries to red pill a new coiner as fast as possible and with a high degree of fidelity. And I thought it was pretty elegant and eloquent. I wanted to ask you, and maybe Brian, who's our marketing guy, we'll link to that tweet storm in the notes. But Murad, when you try to get somebody that you care about into Bitcoin, like what's in your hip pocket? What do you typically pull out, and how does that vary depending on who they are?
So it kind of depends on their demographic. Obviously, like younger people are kind of easier to onboard because they just like see the potential in technology just replacing every facet of human life. But a little bit slightly older people, which I think are even more important at the moment if we care about kind of Bitcoin growth, because like the older people have the money, right?
Mhm.
So typically I combine like two approaches. First, I obviously talk about the potential for like investment appreciation, but the second I talk about how just Bitcoin, like think of it as gold in the digital realm, but like 10 times better in 10 different respects. And then I go like I first and foremost always talk about the scarcity and how like the market monopoly on money is really being challenged. And for the first time, there is a competition between like money products, right? And I like maybe a bit of an exaggeration, but it really gets the people going. I talk about how I like believe that like within 2 decades, Bitcoin will replace like fiat currency. And like as controversial as it is, it like really starts to get people interested and really to get people like at least like discussing it, right?
Mhm.
And so like these are some of the approaches that I use.
Interesting. So let's jump from that and talk about like have you ever tried gifting Bitcoin along with talking about it?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. Actually, the last 5 birthday gifts that I've given were all Bitcoin.
Nice.
And I think that's really something that a lot of Bitcoiners themselves are going to do, because when you do it, if you strongly believe in Bitcoin's growth, then it's really a noble gift, because it's so much better than giving, like, for example, like $100, because they're going to be weaker and weaker. But assuming Bitcoin succeeds, like the power of your gift is going to be echoing in the future. And essentially the way people will think back at you, not only as somebody who was forward thinking, but actually like your gift is helping them more and more, right? So
Yeah.
for in my family and for 2 of my friends, I've been giving like 0.1, 0.2 Bitcoin type gifts like a lot recently.
Yeah, that's awesome. Yeah, one of the things that we want to do is obviously just make it like a no-brainer so anybody can do that for friends and family, but also to kind of expand out into the next, let's call it concentric circle around the target of who you would be willing to do this for. And it's one of the reasons that we decided to use what we call double opt-in, but basically it just means that only if the recipient accepts the gift, basically signs up for the account and accepts the gift, is the transaction initiated. And so basically this lets me, like I was doing last night, emailing a bunch of people that I'm like friends with and sending them some Bitcoin, but knowing that only the ones that actually sign up and are going to receive, the 12 chapters over the next 12 months, along with the price action for the Bitcoin that I gave them, only those people that accept, am I going to be charged, versus kind of like, loading up a USB stick or paper wallet or whatever. And like, you can't really set that and forget it. You can either keep the private key yourself and then like, be a good guy and forget about that later when they finally do accept, but you kind of have to check in with them. And, you're still kind of Bitcoin IT support for life, and kind of on the hook for the education as well. And, and all of those things. So, I'm willing to do that, for my brother or my parents, or maybe like a best buddy from my New York days or something like that. But for 100 other people that I might give to, I'm not willing to handhold them. And that's kind of that's another market that we wanted to serve. Yeah, I love that you said that you think that a lot of Bitcoiners will do this. We have the line, we say, you can either buy Bitcoin for yourself or you can buy it for one of the other 7.5 billion people on the planet.
Right. Mm-hmm.
Cool. Well, okay, so let's go a little bit darker here, let's say, and we promised we would talk a little bit about kind of like attack vectors for Bitcoin as a system and as a network. So not really technical, but more social, political, and just kind of thinking about some of the headwinds that you foresee and then maybe our scenario planning against and trying to hedge against in kind of the longer term, and thinking like where things, you know, I wouldn't even call them necessarily black swans because we're kind of identifying them. I think they're called black elephants if they're things that might happen, but we're kind of identifying them. What are some of the things you think about?
Honestly, I think some of the biggest dangers are, I always think about like the key developers like being abducted by the government. I mean, and this is getting really, really dark, but actually like I've been thinking and talking to people. That's part of the reason why there is a culture in Bitcoin of not making too many core code changes and keeping at least the main elements of the code base intact. And this is because the longer it stays the same way, the more talented programmers around the world can familiarize themselves with the code base. If it changes all the time, then by definition, the amount of people that are keeping track of it nonstop of all the little details is only going to be like 10 people, right? So I believe that like that's part of the reason why there is such a culture in Bitcoin. It's to make, if the code base stays intact and you only tweak very, very small parts going forward, then the system will become less reliant on only half a dozen like developers. I think that's kind of one of the things that has always been bugging me. Second is always, of course, like I would say the actual attack on the network itself, like on the miner side. But I think what we're seeing right now is that the system is progressively becoming physically more decentralized. I believe that some of the statistics that I've seen is that like 2-3 years ago, the system was even more centralized in China than it is right now. So even though that kind of decentralization of the physical like mining equipment and like geographic distribution of mining is happening slowly, it is happening nevertheless, which I think is a positive sign. Last but not least, I think that like the interests of certain countries with respect to their monetary hegemony is they themselves are competitive. So I don't think that what interests the United States might not necessarily interest like China or Russia, etc. And we haven't really seen countries like agree to anything since or even during World War II, right? Even when they were allied at certain points in time. So I think for Bitcoin to get destroyed, literally like the top 20 biggest governments would have to work together. And I think like they aren't necessarily like best friends. They themselves are fighting for limited resources and competing amongst one another in different arenas. So really, and frankly, I think like at the moment, if we go by what central bankers are telling us, I think that they're like hubristic and arrogant responses essentially reveal that they don't really view Bitcoin as a threat at the moment. And a lot of like the older people that I've talked to in traditional finance in general, like a lot of them still think that like Bitcoin is what like American teenagers used to buy weed on the internet with. Like they don't take it seriously as like a gold contender, right? But I think it is, of course. And I think their responses reveal that like the Bitcoin ecosystem still has a few years to make itself stronger before it's even remotely perceived as a threat, which is a good thing, because I think that like by the time they wake up, the system is going to be a lot more robust in various ways, which I think is a positive for the time being.
Yeah, it's interesting. I've almost kind of I've heard the argument so many times around, you know, the countries won't agree, and filtering through that, I actually personally don't think that actually matters or holds much water, because I think the only one that actually does matter is the US. You know, this is 95% of global yield, by far the dominant military force, by far the dominant economic force. for the foreseeable future. And so for me, the kind of how uncomfortable the US could make it for Bitcoin and Bitcoiners if there was ever like a concerted effort. I don't necessarily believe that it would need to be all that coordinated at like a planning level. You could just kind of like, embargo countries that did business with Bitcoin and just cause unrest and do all kinds of crazy things to, essentially retain the right to signage. So that's kind of my number one, worry out there basically. And it's kind of why we're so eager and in such a race. If you think of like the two defenses, and I talk about this on Twitter a bit and bat around ideas with Alex Kruger and some other folks, but this idea that there are two ways. One is kind of all the defenses that you just mentioned around decentralization and not being too dependent on any one coder and things like that. And I think all of the more and more nodes and more people being self-sovereign and educating people to be able to take full possession and be full Bitcoin citizens is all super important. I think there's also another really important defense, which is just getting as many people in high places, but also just pure numbers, constituents in the United States to own and care about Bitcoin and to understand it, and also to sort of tie that to freedom and the natural way, and just keep on raising the point that every founding father of the country had warning quotes around getting off of gold and silver, and that we should never let banks print money, et cetera, for 100 years until almost 200 years until 1913. And all of a sudden World War II, and we kind of forget things, and then 71 it goes off a cliff, right? So I think that's super interesting to also try to inoculate Bitcoin from a social and just like number and diversity of hodlers standpoint, and we're focused on that as well. Let's see. So when you think about some of the central bank digital currency efforts, so kind of what's going on with the Chinese government going and kind of taking over what's been going on with WeChat and Alipay, and kind of just bringing that now back in-house for the CCP. Do you see that model kind of spreading, and digital cash and sort of the panopticon or panopticoins, I guess, being able to see what everybody's doing all the time with their transactions? Is that something we need to worry about in the near term?
I mean, we need to worry about it as human beings, but not as Bitcoiners, I would say. I think like it's just like really like scary dystopian stuff, the way I think about it. Yeah. And honestly, I think I always believed that if those things like get off the ground, it's just going to accelerate more people into Bitcoin. Like if they eliminate cash, then simply both good and bad people will have to choose the most cash-like of the digital, which is Bitcoin, right? Mm-hmm. And so honestly, like if I lived in a country and they imposed that I use the central bank digital currency, be it through commercial systems or the public systems or in my own life, then I would just be moving to cryptocurrencies ASAP.
Yeah.
Or what I would at least do, and which I think is actually more realistic, is that I would essentially not overnight, but I would essentially like use like Bitcoin to save, and then use the central bank currencies to transact, especially if the latter is enforced. But at the margin, that would just push me towards like having 90% of my money wealth in Bitcoin, and then just having 10% in the central bank digital currency, which I think like that's just going to make Bitcoin stronger and stronger.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think anti-fragility certainly seems to be what's going on with Bitcoin, right?
Right.
It's kind of the underlying aspect of the system. Is this good for Bitcoin? This is good for Bitcoin. Is this bad for Bitcoin? This is good for Bitcoin then.
Right.
It's really interesting. Well, cool. Anything else you want to cover?
I think that about covers it. It was really, really enjoyable, and thank you so much for inviting me once again.
Yeah, it's great to see you, and hope to host you here in LA again sometime in 2020.
Absolutely.
All right. Thanks.